Now, some context. Chris asked me to talk to you a bit about resilience and to really set the stage for what you're going to hear later on today. The challenge was that we have a broad array here, or diverse set of I guess, an understanding and sophistication around the use of the concept of resilience in the room. Some of you will be intimately familiar with the issues of what resilience represents, and you will be familiar with the problems with its application. Others of you probably know relatively little about it. So my first challenge then was to try to decide what level I need to present this at, and I decided to take a conceptual approach. You'll probably hear lots of detail later today. The most important thing to take from my talk is just a conceptual idea of what resilience represents in natural ecosystems, and then hopefully to draw that link to reclaim systems. So that's really the objective here. So I'm going to talk, I won't get into some of the minutiae associated with the issues of defining resilience. I'm sure some of the speakers will talk about that, though I will present a definition. So let's get started. What you see here is, I'm going to begin with 3 key points. So on the left side, you're looking at a complex system. So this Irish setter that's chasing a ball is a complex system because it's composed of a whole range of interrelated structure and relationships that together constitute some measure of complexity that we see manifested through development. But there are 3 key points about complex systems. And the complex system we're going to talk about are ecosystems. Those are defined as complex systems because they have the same essential attributes as any individual, as you and I, as communities, as natural systems. So complex systems arise in nature through an inherent capacity for self-organization. It means that when you pull the right features together, things will start to organize through some inherent capabilities. And I'll explore that issue in a few minutes in more detail to tell you why it is that natural ecosystems are self-organized. Self-organization, then, is the interaction between structure and process that leads to system development. And that's going to be important when we think about resilience in a few minutes. We need to consider structure, and we need to think about process and how that leads to development. Now, the key point here, and one of its core difficulties, is resilience is an emergent property of complex systems. So it's the outcome of their capacity for self-organization. What that means is that you really can't, in a sense, manage for resilience because you can't really see it. What you can do is you can instill a capability for resilience to emerge as part of the development in complex systems. And that's a real challenge because, in a sense, it's an intangible concept in a lot of different ways. And I think that has led to some of the issues that we've had in trying to understand what resilience represents, and also in trying to manage for it. Now, change over time is ubiquitous in complex systems. Chris mentioned this, that change is not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, change occurs all the time. It's just that in certain contexts, around management of natural resources, we seem to try to avoid change, which is to fly in the face of resilience in many respects. But I've put some examples here of how change manifests itself in a whole range of natural systems. What you see here is a picture of Elvis Presley as a child, and Elvis Presley as a young adult. And if you're old enough, I suppose, you know who Elvis Presley is, you'll know that Elvis went on to change dramatically in the rest of his life. But we also see changes amongst individuals and populations, and that graph there shows the human population development over the last 10,000 years or so. And what this graph shows, of course, is the exponential rise in population over time. So complex systems change in that respect. They also change amongst populations. And here's an idealized representation of serial stage development in forest ecosystems. And you'll see more of this example in a moment. But the basic idea is that we see changes amongst population on the same space. And those changes occur, and they're perfectly natural over time. And those changes are differences in populations that we call and refer to as communities. And in this figure here, what we see are changes that occur amongst communities. This is a photograph taken in 1913 in Miami. And you can see that it was comprised of a whole range of natural ecosystems with some human influence. And today, it's clearly a totally human-dominated change that's occurred with much less the influence over natural systems. So change over time is something we expect from complex systems. So change is ubiquitous in complex systems, and resilience theory helps us to learn, adapt, and to manage for change instead of against change. And I'll return to this point a little later, because a lot of our management practices and our activities, in fact, seem to be designed to resist changes. Now, resilience theory suggests that complex systems can exist in fundamentally different regimes or states. And resilience, then, is the property that mediates transitions amongst those different states. It's resilience that confers in ecosystems an ability to resist change. So let's talk about this concept of self-organization, because from a reclamation perspective, it's essential. What we're really trying to do is create the conditions for self-organization to occur, hopefully in a direction that fits with our end land use objectives. So let's highlight that issue a little bit more. Some photographs to illustrate this kind of cartoon illustration of change over time in some forest ecosystem. So that change occurs through the concept of self-organization. So we begin, and in this example, we started with an agricultural system that was abandoned. What we see is an early cereal stage that's shrub-dominated, and in this case, we see eventual replacement of that community, a change over time as it becomes dominated by deciduous species, and finally a transition to a coniferous system. So it's just an illustration of change over time in forest ecosystems. The question is, what drives that change? And the answer is there are three processes that are important for that change. Those processes are autogenic, allogenic, and what we call biogenic. So competition is a predominant driver of change in all ecosystems. Following a major disturbance, typically space is abundant and available in ecosystems. And so competition occurs for that space as species try to occupy the available space. Eventually, over time, two-dimensional space is fully occupied, and then we see competition in the third dimension in height. And there's other competition, of course, below ground that's much less obvious. But the point is, competition is a major driver in self-organized systems. It's important to remember that. But fire, wind, and climate are examples of allogenic processes. And they are also important for change. And they're also important for resilience. Because the question is, what is the impact of these processes on change? Do they cause a fundamental shift in the basic state space, if you wish, of an ecosystem? Does it cause qualitative changes in the processes and structure of those systems? And resistance to that change is resilience. And then we have biogenic processes, things like insect outbreaks and diseases. So resilience then constitutes the relative susceptibility to these processes. So these three processes destabilize the system by altering its structure and or the underlying processes that give rise to structure. Now, perturbations, or what we refer to as disturbance, there are two types, and they vary from acute. So disturbance can be intense and short-lived, like fire, drought, or insect epidemics, or disturbances can be chronic, slow, long-term effects, in other words. Competition, nutrient loading, poor soil structure, and chemistry are examples of perturbations that are much longer term. And it's important to remember that change in self-organized systems occurs both in response to acute disturbance, but also in response to chronic, slow changes, slow disturbances. I need to provide a definition now. We should clarify what we're talking about with respect to resilience. I've spoken in general terms about the concept, but I put a quote up here that's important as well. which says that the debate about stability or resilience in ecological theory is marked by a frightful confusion of terms and concepts, and that's certainly the case. Resilience is really an ill-defined term. I think there's no question about that. That's not unusual in ecology. We have other terms that are fairly ill-defined. That doesn't make them mean they're not useful, and certainly resilience is a useful and important concept. But in the report that I'm going to do for Chris, that's due in March, I will talk much more about definitions and the issues associated with them. But we should at least put something up in terms of defining what resilience is. So I put two typically general definitions of resilience. One is called ecosystem resilience. It's a term that Buzz Halling, Halling is one of the leaders was a leader in the development of this concept of resilience. And he suggests that it's the capacity of an ecosystem to tolerate disturbance or perturbation, if you wish, without changing into a qualitatively different state. Another way to think about this is inertial stability. How hard is it to move that ecosystem into a different state? Now, another concept of resilience you'll hear about is called engineering resilience. And that's the length of time that a system takes to return to equilibrium or stability following perturbation. It's also been called elastic stability. Now, if you think about it, these definitions look like they're reasonably precise, but in fact, they're not. There's lots of terminology in here for which you might pose the question. So what is disturbance exactly? How much does it occur? What do we mean by equilibrium? How do we decide how long something returns? And what's one qualitative state versus another? What does that all mean? Now, I'm not going to get into those issues because they're not that important to this discussion. The only important thing here is that you have some concept of resilience in terms of what it means in natural systems and in fact in reclaimed systems. So let's pursue that in a little more detail. We need to bring disturbance into this because disturbance is really what's driving this change. And it's important to understand the nature of disturbance. Disturbance can be important for driving change that we want to see, and it can be important for driving change that we think is undesirable. So I've shown there are 4 examples of disturbance in this particular slide. So again, we have an idealized set of serial stages here, serial stage development in the upper panel. We continue to fail this experiment. There. We have a series of serial stages in the upper panel, and then what I put some idealized disturbances. So what these disturbances do is they disrupt self-organization. That's what you can think about disturbances doing. It takes self-organization and it rearranges it in some way. Sometimes it does it by removing structure, like biomass. Sometimes it just rearranges biomass. So let's look at disturbances 2 and 3. So these are relatively benign disturbances. I've suggested insect outbreaks and a moderate fire might be examples of these kinds of disturbances. So with disturbance 2, what we see is that the ecosystem is, in a sense, reset or reorganized. Its degree of organization is degraded in some way, and that's exemplified by moving back to the left. So what we expect is that development in this ecosystem, its self-organization moves from left to right. So disturbance 2 moves that, degrades organization to some degree, but not to the point where the ecosystem can't recover and move back to this state here. So in this case, we would say the system is resilient. There's no real change in serial stage. So what we're focusing on here is serial stage. We're asking ourselves, is a given serial stage resistant to a particular disturbance regime? With disturbance 2, what we see is that we move it from, say, this Douglas fir stage back to an earlier shrub stage. And that might occur through, disturbance 3 we're talking about. So through a moderate fire, what this particular example illustrates is that the system moves back, but then it essentially stops at some point. We don't actually see a full development of the existing Douglas fir stand. So that occurred prior to the disturbance. So in this case, we would say that that disturbance exceeds system resilience. We've moved it to a qualitatively different state. That's particularly exemplified by disturbance 4, which might be a very severe fire. Imagine we had very dry drought conditions and a fire went through that burned both the canopy and all of the organic matter on the forest floor. And that's certainly not unusual. I've been in lots of fires that have that characteristic. Now in this case, in this example, what we're doing, we've pushed the ecosystem back to a very early seral stage. And so a severe fire certainly exceeds ecosystem resilience. We've reached what's called a new equilibrium. So now we've drastically altered this ecosystem by this disturbance. It's moved to a qualitative different state. We've exceeded its resilience. But I want you to draw your example to one more quite interesting role of disturbance. It can actually push an ecosystem along in terms of seral stage development. It's not always the case that disturbance moves disrupts organization and moves it back to an earlier stage. It can also be necessary to move it to a subsequent stage. So in this case, if we see a wind throw event, sometimes that's necessary in order to open up the canopy for shade intolerant species to really begin to dominate the next seral stage. So the point is here that disturbance is complex, that it functions at various scales and it functions at various intensities, and it's that scale and intensity combined that really dictate what constitutes resilience in a given ecosystem. But there's one more point that I make at the bottom which is difficult to see, so I'll read it. Note that overall, the ecosystem is resilient to disturbances 2 through 4 because if we look at seral stage development overall, so imagine that our time frame is in fact the entire sequence of seral stages rather than a given seral stage. We can certainly argue that in fact this system is resilient at this temporal stage to all of those disturbances. So the point here is that resilience, another component of resilience that's important, is to understand the temporal frame as well. So resilience, it depends how you define resilience, partly depends on the time frame. If you're interested in just seral stages, then you get to draw a different conclusion than if you're interested in a complete pattern of change over time. So that's a very relevant point. Now I'm going to draw a metaphor in here, and what's interesting about the resilience literature is that it's rife with metaphors. It's quite unusual from the perspective of science. But in this case, this metaphor is quite useful. It's referred to as the marble in a cup or the ball in a cup metaphor. And it's useful for understanding how we conceive of change over time and the relationship of disturbance to resilience. So again, here's this idealized set of seral stages. And what you see here is what are called a series of stability domains. And these stability domains define where we expect the ecosystem to move in relation to disturbance. So remember, the ecosystem is driven by selforganization. So succession occurs then down this slope. And you'll notice that I've drawn several inclines in this stability domain. And these inclines separate one stability domain from another one. So in this case, what we expect is that at some point the ecosystem moves down this domain, and then at some point it will remain essentially in this seral stage, which we might define as a climax stage, unless something happens to push it to the next stage. And so let's now introduce disturbance into this to understand how these stability domains work with respect to disturbance. So what I put now is I've inserted disturbance onto this slide. So this is the same set of disturbance regimes that I showed you previously. Notice that if we started our ecosystem in this particular space in the stability domain, that with disturbances 2 and 3, the system would eventually move back to that particular location on the stability domain. If we add disturbance 1 to that system, it actually pushes it into a different stability domain. And finally, we can in fact move to an entirely different disturbance or stability domain if disturbance is sufficiently severe that we see a significant shift in the qualitative state of an ecosystem. So the idea here then is to think about stability domains when you think about resilience. It's the ability of the system to remain within a particular stability domain that constitutes resilience. When a disturbance event occurs that moves the system beyond that domain, that's when we see qualitative shifts that in many cases we might consider undesirable, but which is not always the case, which is illustrated here with disturbance 1. So let's review what we know so far. So autogenic, allogenic, and biogenic processes are the main drivers of change in self-organizing systems. Resilience constitutes the relative susceptibility to these processes. Now, relative susceptibility is correlated with ecological diversity within different functional groups, and that's an important point. There's been a considerable debate in the literature about the role of diversity in resilience. What we seem to understand at this point is that it's diversity within functional groups that's important. Now, I've highlighted just 3 functional groups. There are more in a system, but basically we can think of diversity in producers, consumers, and decomposers as being an important correlate with resilience. If you've got diversity in those groups, that tends to promote resilience. Diversity is necessary but not sufficient. And that's because not all species are of equal importance in maintaining ecosystem function, and hence resilience. Keystone species play roles that are disproportionate to their numbers in the dynamics of communities. An example of a keystone species you're probably familiar with is likely aspen. Aspen's probably a keystone species in many of these communities around Fort McMurray. Removal of a keystone species can trigger nonlinear responses that lead to cascades of local extinction, a fundamental change in the nature of the ecosystem. So ecosystem resilience is thus reduced. And we often see this in management with natural systems. You can remove a lot of species and the ecosystem appears to retain much of its resilience. In other words, it maintains its qualitative state. It looks as if nothing's really happened except you've lost a few species. However, if it's a keystone species, what we suddenly see is a collapse in the community structure and a shift, a qualitative shift into a different structure. And there are plenty of examples in resource management for this. So keystone species are important, and diversity within particular functional groups are important.